All right, this short flip lesson is basically just to get you into the frame of mind of what we're going to be dealing with over the next couple of days, and really that last topic before the unit test on post-World War II, Cold War, and the culture of the 1950s. And you see this kind of collage thing here. What we're going to do and what we want you to think about, obviously, is what makes up the culture of the 1950s? What was it like to live in that post-World War II era? What was it like to live in the late 40s and early 50s? So having some of those kind of background pieces to understand what the culture was like of the time is a part of this. The other aspect, and I think the more interesting one, I think the one where there can be some debate, and if you ask grandparents or great-grandparents or you ask your parents what they think about the 1950s, it is that idea of trying to get you to look at the decade as a whole and the culture as a whole, and to look at it in terms of, as it says here, the positive and or the negative types of things, and to really think about, okay, and I'll show you here in just a second the kind of listing of the cultural aspects, those that you are reading from the article that I gave you called Culture in the 1950s, the segments from the century that show the cultural aspects of the 1950s. What we want you to start doing is really not just memorizing those things, but to really think about, okay, well, what was that good or bad? Was this a positive thing or a negative thing? And I think it becomes a learning tool. I think it becomes something that we do then with every decade. I think we look at the decade that we are currently in, or we look at the decade that we came out of. You look at the decade that your parents grew up in, probably most of them either the 70s or 80s, and you really start to think about, okay, well, this thing happened culturally, but all right, is that good or bad? And who was it good or bad for? And so I think the other aspect that you need to think about is perspective. You know, if you are a teenager, you might view the 50s very differently than somebody who was a middle-aged type of person. If you're a woman, you're going to look at the decade differently. So that's what we're trying to get you to do with this cultural aspect of the 1950s. What I have here, if you'll notice, is just a list of and I'll slow down here so you can see some of these as you watch the video, as you look at section 2 of chapter 18 and pages 481 to 483, and you've watched the century and you've read things about it. The question really becomes that, again, positive and negative aspect. I don't feel like I need to run down the whole list of all of these, but to really get you to thinking about those big ideas. You know, the 1950s were a conservative time. Unemployment was low, inflation was low, lots of kids, the suburbs, that rise of consumerism. And again, what I want you to do is to stop and think to yourself, is this a positive or a negative? Is the growth of suburbs a positive or a negative? How might people look at that? You know, when you look at the growth of suburbs, that sameness, that conformity becomes a big deal. And is conformity a good thing? In the video, it talked about how it was okay to wear any color shirt you wanted to as long as it was a white shirt. Is that good? Is that a bad thing? What are the positives and negatives? It's not even necessarily that you have to ultimately make a judgment, but just to think about the parts of the different aspects of it. You know, television, again, a big aspect of the television, a big aspect of the 1950s. Again, positive, negative. You know, how do you take a look at that? Some of these that we didn't really spend a lot of time with are cultural aspects, but I really want you to think about all of those cultural things, being able to, for a test, to be able to look at some images, because remember, it is a test based on images, and to kind of express, here's what it was like, you know, and I kind of skipped over this one, maybe one of the most important one. Women are expected to stay at home and raise the kids. That's one that brings up a lot of positive and negative aspects. There were people that will say, oh, that's when the family was solid. You know, you had a mom and a dad, and as that one woman said in the video, it's a couple's society. okay, so it was family oriented and the baby boom was happening, but if you were a woman and you had been in World War II working in a factory and now you're relegated back to that position, this idea of some found that stay-at-home role boring. And was that good for women? Was it bad for women? I think you're going to see when we talk about the 60s, this transformation of a women's rights movement coming about in the 60s. A lot of times it is a reaction to those things from the 1950s. So again, keeping the thought process going that you do need to be familiar with the cultural aspects of the 1950s, but then also those kind of judgment calls that need to be made. So again, this, along with the video, along with the article that I ask you to read, should be a really good start for you in looking at the culture of the 1950s.